All right. Well, that takes care of the 16th century. Okay. Now we'll we'll move on to the 17th now.
Hi, Rabbi.
Yep.
Hey, all right. Who's that? Is that Lee?
Roth.
No. Who's saying hi?
Lenny Roth.
Lenny Raw. I can't see your picture, Lenny.
It's Sunday
Are
morning,
you
Rabbi.
hiding from me, Lenny? Are you hiding from me?
I'm, it's Sunday
Having a
morning.
bad hair day? What? What's going on here?
My hair days are always bad, Rabbi. It's a bramble bush.
Okay. Yeah. Turn off.
But I'm ready to learn.
You ready to learn? All right. Well, I'm gonna do my best. Hey, Ronnie, Leah, see
Good
everybody.
morning, Rabbi.
Good morning. Good morning. See two empty chairs for Aurora and Bob. All right. Joan, I see you up there. Nini, I don't hear you. I don't hear you, Nini. All right. Should we wait another minute or two, Jennifer?
It looks like we have all the folks who came over from Rabbi Horowitz's class, so I think you can go ahead and get started. We'll have a couple
Okay.
more trickle in, I'm sure.
All right. All right. All right. Well, good morning, everybody. And it's a pleasure to see you on a beautiful Sunday morning. So today we're going to continue with our look at the four paths to God. It's really 3 1/4, to be honest with you, because conservative, Orthodox, and Reform are the three main, overwhelmingly dominant movements in our country. The fourth one is Reconstructionist Judaism, which most of you probably don't know anything about, except you might have heard the name. And so we're not going to give a full session to that. We're probably going to give a half session, if that, frankly. But I want to acknowledge it because it has a number of adherents that I think it deserves our attention, so that when you hear the term Reconstructionist Judaism, you'll have some idea of what it is and what its place is in the American Jewish world. Anyway, let's get right to the point. Today we're going to continue with Orthodox Judaism. We're continuing on Orthodoxy because there's a lot to be said about Orthodox Judaism. And as I said before, and I think this is worth repeating, Orthodox Judaism considers itself Judaism. Orthodoxy is a name that was added to it many, many centuries after it already was, because Judaism was always just Judaism. And so they had to come up with a name to distinguish it from those who also claimed to be Judaism, which was conservative Judaism and which was Reform Judaism. So when they had names with adjectives, Orthodoxy was left with, then what are we? Gefilte fish. We have to have a name that you don't just say Judaism and then Reform and Conservative Judaism. So now they call themselves Orthodox. And Orthodox, the one idea, the one philosophy, the singular belief that you must be Orthodox means you must be accepting of the core tenets of Judaism as it has been traditionally understood and taught and practiced. And as we noted last week, and just now pick up now where we left off, I shared with you that there were two basic Judaisms, if you will, that were still Orthodox. There was no real distinction. They didn't call themselves Ashkenazi and Sephardi, but that's what they were. They were by location. So Jews who lived in Europe after the expulsion of the Jews from the land of Israel in the year 70, and then later on in 135, when Bar Kokhba rebellion, 135 to 150, the Bar Kokhba rebellion against the Romans, the last stand of the Jewish people failed. That was it for Jewish life in the land of Israel. That began the diaspora as we know it today, or it is called in Hebrew the Galut. The Galut. We live in the Galut, even under modern understandings of Jewry. Israelis speak of the Galut. They mean all Jews who don't live in Israel. Even today, they speak of that term. And in the English, we call it diaspora, okay, which means the spreading out of our people beyond the land where the Jewish people were born, where the Jewish faith took root, and where Jewish history began. So those Jews who went north into Europe, as it was in those days, and those who went to South Africa, North Africa rather, they developed apart from each other. It wasn't like today. They had no internet. There was no communication between the two, essentially. Very little correspondence between the two. Um, and so Orthodox Judaism moved in one direction, Sephardic Judaism and this Ashkenazi moved in one direction, Sephardic Judaism moved in another. And I mentioned last week that they were in different environments because Ashkenazi Judaism was an oppressed people almost from the beginning, because in the third century, the Roman Empire adopted Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire, which put an end to Jewish conversions, which not allowed Judaism to be freely practiced. It was very dangerous to be a Jew. And so the Jews found themselves living by force and by uh, by by uh, by benefit, and in what we would call ghettos today, which is to say they lived in ghettos because, from their own perspective, it protected them. At least you had a wall around your community that kept you safe. From the Romans' perspective, putting people and forcing them into parts of the community was a punitive action, was to separate them because they weren't worthy to live with the rest of humanity. But there was a positive side for Judaism as well. But the negative side was as well that when you live in a tight and oppressed community, Ashkenazi Judaism became very insular. It didn't look out. It didn't accept any ideas from the outside. It didn't even know of ideas from the outside. And so it focused on what it knew, which was Jewish teaching, Jewish Torah. The Talmud began coming into existence at this period, was finally codified in the 5th century. But even at the beginning, the study hall became where a Jew could exploit his knowledge, his ability to think and discern and to be innovative and creative, because that was a safe text. Take a text of the Torah and work it through all the minutia, work the detail, take every word, every letter, every possible combination, the parallel where one word appears here, one word appears there. You know, it's called the Gezerah Shabbat, which means the two words must be connected somehow. Well, that gave rise to a whole body of new laws, of new interpretations, new understandings. So everything was very closed in. That's why Orthodox Judaism, that comes from the Ashkenazi world, um, focused on the dit and the dot of every Jewish law. Whatever the Torah said, it says Shemoret Yom HaShabbat Lekodsho, you shall honor the Sabbath to keep it holy. Torah doesn't exactly tell us how. The rabbis sitting in these little study halls in Ashkenazi Europe worked those lines to death, which is why we have so many hundreds, if not thousands, of laws about how to honor the Sabbath today. On the contrary, you have the Sephardic Jewish community in North Africa. You lived in the Muslim community. The Muslim world, which was much later, of course, Muslims didn't come until the 7th century, but 6th century. But the Muslim world offered the Jew more opportunity, more ability to prosper financially, the ability to live among the larger community, to study, to become doctors, to have much more opportunity. And so the Sephardic world grew up in a different environment. The Sephardic world was more worldly. It accepted secular education in addition to Jewish education. It had worship which was more open to ideas. It was not as prudish as Ashkenazi Jewry was. And it was much more integrated into the worldview of the Jews and the Muslim communities as a whole. Now, what happened to these Jewries when this new land that we live in today was founded, was discovered? If you know the history of American Judaism, you know that the earliest American Jews were Sephardim. The Sephardim were the Jews who came here first. The Sephardim came here first because there was a lot of opportunity for Jews who live here first, whereas in the Ashkenazi world of Europe, there was a fear of Jews leaving the shtetl, if you will, as oppressive as it was. There was a fear that if you left the shtetl and you came to an unregulated, wild world, that you would lose your community and you would lose your adherence to the Judaism in which you had been raised. Sephardic Jews were not afraid of the world. Ashkenazi Jews were afraid. The rabbis cautioned anyone who thought that leaving the protection of the community in Europe and going to this America, this would be the end of you as a Jew. You would forget it all. You would not be able to continue practicing the halacha, Jewish law. This was a negative. And so the Jews of Europe were very hesitant to leave even what was an oppressive environment. The first synagogue founded in the United States was the Sephardic synagogue, the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue in New York, which still exists, by the way. I've been to that synagogue. You can go visit it. They have tours all the time. It's a very old synagogue, and it's in New York City, and yet it's still here. Another very well-known early synagogue. You'll notice that the most famous early synagogues of America were all Sephardic. The second one was the Touro Synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island. Some of you have been up there to see that too. Fascinating synagogue. The building looks just like it did when it was constructed in 1763. The New York Synagogue, Spanish and Portuguese, was founded in 1654. Then we have Orthodox Sephardic synagogues that were established in Savannah, in Philadelphia, Charleston, Richmond. By contrast, the first Reformed synagogue wasn't founded until 1824. So Sephardic synagogues were where the people were who came to America and wanted to be Jewish. Now, the Sephardic synagogues are the synagogues that established, if you will, not only themselves as a Jewish community where they were, but they also established ways of operating that impact us still today in 2020. The very notion, for example, of paying dues. You know, when you were a Jew living in Europe, or you were a Jew living in the Sephardic North African countries, you didn't pay dues. In fact, historically, Jews never paid dues. The way it was done was the government typically assigned a certain number of Jews in the Jewish community to do two things: to collect taxes from the Jewish community, to go to the national government. And in return for raising taxes, the Jewish leaders were permitted to take a percentage of it to fund Jewish institutional life in the communities around Europe and North Africa. Now, what's interesting about that is that means that for synagogues throughout history in Europe and North Africa, the funding came from your taxes, if you will, before they were sent up to the government capital, the treasury there. Well, what happens when you come to this America, which has no rules, it has no central government to support synagogues or churches. Every community is left to its own. How do you survive? And so somebody with chachmas said, you know what? Everybody's going to have to pay. You're going to have to pay for us to put up the building. You're going to have to pay for us to run the services. You're going to have to pay for us to have somebody to lead the services and the prayer books and to pay for the cleaning up of the synagogue after the Kiddush. We have the first notion of dues here in the United States. It wasn't the United States then, of course, in the 1600s. But nonetheless, that notion that synagogue membership was going to be based on dues. Not only was going to be based on dues, but the synagogue was going to have certain standards for behavior if you wanted to be part of that community. Which is to say that in these synagogues, these Sephardic synagogues, they established that you agreed to be a kosher person, you agreed to keep the Sabbath, you agreed to do this, you agreed to do that. There were certain prerequisites before you could be part of that community. You couldn't be part of the community and not follow the norms, because if you didn't follow the norms, that could be a divisive factor in these early synagogues. You couldn't have synagogues that were not together. There was just too much out there separating the Jews already. They had to have some cohesiveness. And so they established certain requirements. Now, over time, even the Sephardic synagogues began to lessen in their obligations that they made upon their Jewish members. And we notice in some of the declarations, which we still have, by the way, we still have documents from this period, the 1600s, and we can see the difference over time as it becomes more and more that what you'll do that's not halachic, you'll do in private. What you do, where you go, you'll go, but nobody will see you. You'll eat, but you have to go over there, and they have all kinds of exceptions and changes which adapted to the American Jewish condition, which is, of course, precisely what the Ashkenazi Orthodox community in Europe was afraid of to begin with. That there's no way you could continue to be a really fully observant Jew in the United States because it was a total Wild West. Turned out they were right. And that's why Reform Judaism grew here. It struggled in Europe. We're going to get to that later. All right. They did not have an ordained rabbi here in the United States in the Orthodox world until 1840. It was almost 200 years before an Orthodox rabbi was here. There was no place to train an Orthodox rabbi here in these states. There was no rabbinical seminary. There was no place where Orthodox rabbis could grant smicha, could ordain rabbis, as was the tradition, that halakhically, according to early Jewish history to the modern time, you don't need to be ordained a rabbi in a rabbinical school. You needed a rav who would then train you, teach you, and then ordain you. So it was passed down rabbi to rabbi. But what happens when there's no rabbi to pass it down to another rabbi? So there was 200 years that American Jews lived in this country, and we did not have a rabbi. First Orthodox rabbi, first rabbi was 1840. And when this rabbi came in 1840, when the rabbi started coming, it did so largely because the Reform movement was starting to take root here, and the Reform movement had different ideas about what it was to have a rabbinical leader in a synagogue. You know, you don't have to have a rabbi to conduct services. That's true even today. You know, if you don't feel well and you want to stay home, you can open up a prayer book and you can daven. You can do the service yourself. If you want a minyan, you can go out and find 9 friends, come to your house. You can have a service yourself. The reason most communities needed a rabbi was to make sure something was kosher, to make sure the chickens were flicked right, to make sure that the cows were cut right, shechted right. So you needed a rabbi who had those kinds of requirements. And at the same time, even if you didn't have a rabbi in Jewry throughout the world, you always could find somebody who was learned in shechita, who studied with a rabbi, who knew what the laws were, and he could fill in. So a rabbi's involvement with the community was much less than it is today. We're going to see that evolution a little bit as we go along. All right, let's keep moving. By 1825, there were 40 synagogues in the entire United States. Most of them were Sephardic. By 1900, just 75 years later, there were more than 200 synagogues in New York City alone. So we can see the massive influx of Jews that came into the United States toward the end of the 1800s. Now we know why they came. Anybody know why they came? It was the Tsar, the beloved Tsar. You know, in Fiddler on the Roof, may the Lord keep the Tsar far away from us, right? So the Tsar unleashed a wave of pogroms in the late 1800s, which devastated Russian Jewry, spread into Polish Jewry, and became so horrific that hundreds of thousands of Jews left Russia and the Pale of Settlement and moved west and boarded those ships to the United States. So let's not go quite there yet. Let's back it up just a little bit less. By the 1850s, we saw an immigration into the United States of German Jews. And the German Jews who came to the United States were not Orthodox. They were, many of them, involved with the emerging Reform movement in Europe. But it was not a particularly satisfying movement. It was trying to establish itself in Europe, primarily in Germany, and then in England and France, other countries too. Yes. So, but it was never successful in Europe, and it wasn't successful for one of the reasons I mentioned earlier. It didn't have any money. All the money was being held by the religious councils, the deputies of Jews, whatever they were called, which supported the synagogues, paid for the rabbis, paid for everything that went on in the synagogue. Reform Judaism required you to pay dues. It's the only way it could pay for itself. And that was not a successful model. Jews were not accustomed to paying out of their own pocket to join a synagogue. And by the way, do I need to tell you that that's exactly the problem that Reform and Conservative Judaism are having in the state of Israel today, where the government of the state of Israel continues through its various departments to fund Orthodox synagogues, but does not fund the Reform and Conservative synagogues. As long as Reform and Conservative synagogues in Israel have to be supported by dues, we are going to struggle. We're going to struggle because there's 100 Orthodox synagogues in your neighborhood for every one Reform or Conservative synagogue. The Orthodox synagogues are everywhere. They are everywhere. They're more numerous than churches here in the United States. You think we have a lot of churches? In Israel, all you need is a hole in the wall and 10 chairs, and you've got a shul. You don't need a rabbi, and most of them don't have a rabbi. All you need is some books, a couple of Torah scrolls. You know, it's very low maintenance to open a synagogue. The larger synagogues that have a rabbi, the rabbi may not come every week, or the rabbi may come, but he will largely be paid for his salary by the religious council. And the religious council will also make sure you've got fresh prayer books, that your Torahs are kept in good repair. You'll have to pay as a member, as an Orthodox synagogue, you'll have to pay if you want to sponsor a kiddush or something, but that's not essential. You know, most people, as soon as the services are over in Israel, they don't have a kiddush. They do whatever they do. They run out the door because they want to go home. There's a lovely Shabbat dinner waiting for them on their Shabbat lunch waiting for them when they get home. And so it's a very different world in Israel, but it's much like the world that existed in Europe. Okay, so the early Jews who came to the United States were from Germany. They were looking not so much for a new religious environment, they were looking for a way to make more money. They had some opportunities in Europe, but it wasn't enough. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that when we talk about Reform Judaism and how Reform Judaism was able to begin. But suffice it to say that there were tremendous breakthroughs in government in Europe in the 1800s, thanks to the Napoleonic emancipation of the Jews and the French Revolution. So Jews were able to do more than they had ever been able to do. And for many Jews, this was an opportunity of a lifetime. They were ready to break from the rigors of Orthodox Judaism. They wanted to be part of the greater society. But unfortunately, European reforms for many Jews did not go far enough. And when the United States opened its doors and allowed Jews to come into the United States in the early to mid 1800s, this provided an opportunity for many of these Jews to flee, not from fear of life, but to have new opportunities to become somebodies in this new Wild West world. Okay, so when they came to the United States, they came looking for a Judaism that would parallel their own secular instincts, which is they wanted a Judaism that did not separate them from the rest of this newly emerging America. They wanted a Judaism that fit in with it. And Reform Judaism, which had roots in Europe but never got its tracking, was able to be much more appealing and workable in a place like the United States, where there were no rules and there were no deputies of Jews and there was no board that controlled money. And so these Jews became what we now call the uptown Jews. These were the Jews who tried to live in areas adjacent to where non-Jews lived and tried to make their synagogues look more like the churches, which were also in their neighborhood. So a Reform temple looked very much and felt very much and sounded inside very much like a good Protestant church. It wasn't a Protestant church, it was a Jewish temple, but they took out the Hebrew, and there are a number of other changes they made so that it would be more acceptable. You could bring your non-Jewish friend to a Reformed temple and he would not be alienated or offended. Okay, we're going to pause here for a couple of questions. Yes, Ronnie.
Okay. During that time, though, when you talk about Jews wanting upward mobility and to fit into society, weren't there still quotas at the in the universities as to the number of Jews they would admit?
There were still quotas in everything. You as a Jew had many more business opportunities, but not in the big firms. I mean, you could not just go into, you could not go to, the oil companies, for example, where there was Standard Oil. You couldn't get a job in Standard Oil. You couldn't do a lot of things. You were still very limited. But everything is relative, isn't it? You are still limited. But if you came from Europe and you came to New York or you came to someplace here in the United States, it was like opportunity galore. you know, you could put your stuff on a peddler's cart, and you could go to another town, and you could open up a little store, and you can become a somebody. So it didn't mean that you had all the advantages that we take for granted today, most of us, but it did mean that things were much better here. There was still anti-Semitism. There were still limits in terms of what neighborhood you could live in. Glass ceilings were very thick, so you knew you couldn't go high in certain businesses at all. You couldn't go into law. You could go into medicine because you would just see the patients in your house. Okay, you didn't need to have a clinic. You didn't need to be part of a hospital. We had to establish our own hospital. We have our own Jewish hospitals even today up in the Northeast. The Miriam Hospital in Rhode Island, where I was province, that hospital was founded because the other hospitals wouldn't take Jewish doctors. Now today the hospital is still there, but it's mixed. It's not just Jewish anymore. Same thing in New York. We have the name of it is slipping me. It's a very famous hospital.
Mount Sinai?
Yes, Mount Sinai Hospital, one of the great hospitals in New York. How could I forget Mount Sinai? Okay. I knew the word somewhere, right? So and so yeah, so why was that hospital founded in New York, Mount Sinai Hospital? Because Jewish doctors couldn't get work at other hospitals. So we
But
established our own.
they could go to medical school.
They could go to some medical schools. That's right, some medical schools, not all. Many of the colleges and universities until modern times were run by churches or religious institutions. They were founded by Baptists, founded by Methodists, and so they had their own rules, each one, about their attitude toward having Jews as students and Jews being graduated as doctors. So it was known where Jews would go, and it was known where Jews didn't go. It was known where Jews could live. It was known where Jews couldn't live. And Jews knew all these things too. And so you worked around them. All right. When I was in Providence, Rhode Island, I had a congregation there for 12 years. Members of my congregation would tell me that as they grew up in Providence, and most of my congregation was native Providence, you knew what streets you could not only live on, but what streets you could go on. Okay. So I heard stories about you knew as you walked through a neighborhood where you could turn left or where you had to turn right. So never mind where you could live, but you know what? They said, you got used to it. That's just the way you walk. That's the route you took. The Irish had their streets, and the Italians had their streets, and everybody had their neighborhoods, and everybody had their industries that they controlled, and everybody was Irish and everybody was Italian, and then you had doctors hospital like Miriam where everybody was Jewish. It was sort of like an understanding that everybody needs to know their place, okay? And that took a long time to overcome. But we still see the remnants of it when we talk about Mount Sinai Hospital in New York. We talked about Miriam Hospital in Providence, and there were other such hospitals all over the Northeast where the largest Jewish communities were, because you had doctors who simply could not work, Jewish doctors could not work in non-Jewish hospitals. Okay, in the mid-1800s, there was an attempt to solidify the Orthodox Jewish community by establishing what was called the Chief Rabbi of the United States. I'm sure you never heard of this, but you know that in most European countries to this day, there is a chief rabbi. The chief rabbi of the British Empire just passed away last week, Rabbi Jonathan Sacks,
Right,
extraordinary
right.
rabbi. I was talking with Rabbi Strauss about it yesterday. Um, he spoke about it. It was his sermon, and I observed to Rabbi Strauss after the service that I think that he was perhaps the most significant Orthodox rabbi in my lifetime. Okay, his influence on me, his influence on the world. He was a astounding speaker and scholar and lecturer, and he was an Orthodox rabbi. He didn't do a whole lot for non-Orthodox Judaism that lived in England, the British Empire. That wasn't his job. His job was to be the rabbi of the British Empire, which is an Orthodox position, as it is in every country where such chief rabbis exist. Um, Israel has two chief rabbis, by the way. It has a chief rabbi Ashkenazi and a chief rabbi Sephardi. Much of the history of those two positions has been unpleasant. Sometimes they don't speak to one another. They seldom work with one another. Each one thinks the other is an idiot and doesn't know anything about Jewish law. And again, this goes back to the whole notion, Ashkenazi and Sephardi had very different worldviews. And when they came to Israel in the 1940s and 50s, and the airlifts, mostly from the Sephardic countries, um, the Ashkenazi considered the Sephardim to be poorly trained, lax in religious observance, um, not nearly as strict and scrupulous in the practice of Judaism. And so, therefore, to this day, they tend to be apart in terms of their respect for one another and their working with one another and where they live with one another. Now, there's been a slight meshing of the two. This is sort of an aside, but it's an important aside. Um, what it has done, it has caused over the last 30, 40 years. Uh, for a while, there was such an intense inferiority complex that many Sephardi Jews had because the Ashkenazi chief rabbi and the Ashkenazi yeshiva world is so overwhelming in Israel. It's all Ashkenazi. And so many Sephardic rabbis and many Sephardic Jews felt in Israel such an inferiority complex that there was a slow and then larger movement within Sephardic Judaism in Israel to become more Ashkenazi. So to be more stricter, to be um, more punctilious. You even have Sephardic rabbis that now dress like Ashkenazi rabbis with the black everything. Sephardic rabbis never wore black hat. That was all Ashkenazi. And so we see that there has been a change in Sephardic Judaism, not necessarily for the better. And there have been some Sephardic Jews who have really almost thrown the Sephardic heritage overboard because they want to be accepted more in the mainstream of Orthodox Judaism in Israel. Okay, so that's just an aside, an observation. The illustrious Rabbi Jacob Joseph was brought to New York from Vilna. He was named the chief rabbi, and he was in charge of all of Orthodox Judaism in greater New York, which pretty much meant America, because that's where the Jewish community really was heavily focused. And although he was well-intentioned, he was the first and the last chief rabbi of New York and America, because effectively nobody gave 2 cents about what he had to say or what he thought or whatever his title or position was. Why? Because every synagogue in New York and beyond that was Orthodox was very happy with what it was. It didn't need some rabbi from Vilna to come to America and in broken English or in Yiddish telling them how to be better American Jews. Okay? The idea may have been very appealing to some Jews to have some central authority, and there was no rabbi in America who could fill that position. But can you imagine? Here you are trying to become Americans. You're trying to be Jewish in a new world and trying to fit in while maintaining your identity and character. And you've got a Yiddish speaking rabbi, all dressed in black. He's standing there talking about stuff that has no relevance. And nobody in New York really wanted to hear what he had to say, except the people who brought him there. All right. So we have never had a chief rabbi, Orthodox rabbi, or any other in the United States. Okay. Um, the last thing we're going to look at in terms of Orthodox Judaism is what, how has it changed over the last 300 years? Well, we can say one thing for sure, and this is probably the main thing, and that is it has been emboldened by Israel and by the strength of Israeli Orthodox Jews in Israeli society. Now, many of you know that after the Holocaust, there was a massive immigration of Jews from Europe to Israel. Between 1945 and 1948, and of course after 1948, when the British left and the embargoes were lifted and Jews could freely come into the country. And there was a large number of Jews who came, obviously, and there was a number of Jews who came who were the survivors of the destroyed yeshiva world of Europe. You know that at one time, um, uh, Poland had hundreds of thousands of Jews. It was the largest Jewish community in the world. And tragically, it was destroyed by the Germans. There were some who survived. In every country, there were some Jews who survived, obviously. And those who were really observant, the rabbis who survived the Holocaust, the yeshiva students who survived the Holocaust, many of them went to the United States and established communities here, but others went to Israel. First of all, it was closer. Second of all, it was easier to get to. And third, it was a Jewish place. It had no immigration constraints. It welcomed everyone who could get there. And so when they came to Israel, they went to David Ben Gurion, the first prime minister, and they said that they want to have the opportunity to rebuild Orthodox Judaism because it was gone. It was devastated. They wanted, they needed to rebuild the yeshivas that had been destroyed in Europe because how can you teach a new generation? What does Torah mean? What is Talmud? How do you study? How do you live as a Jew? Unless you have these places of study, which had sustained European Jewry. David Ben Gurion had a lot on his plate. There's no question in 1948, 1949, he was dealing with the survival of the country. You know, the country was attacked on its Independence Day. The next day, planes roared in from a half dozen countries. These Orthodox rabbis were few in number altogether. It was a few thousand. And what they asked for was the opportunity to be left alone. They wanted the opportunity to build the yeshivas and to create a world that had been destroyed. And for that, they asked to be exempted from having to serve in the army. They asked for exemptions from a variety of other things so that they could just focus entirely on the spiritual renewal of Judaism in the new Jewish state. And for Ben Gurion, this was okay. Go ahead, do it, because they weren't a significant number. He could never have contemplated how fast the Orthodox community would grow, the yeshiva community would grow, and the number of rabbis that would emerge after only a few years. Orthodox Judaism has always been a part not only of the social environment in Israel, but it also has been part of the political establishment. It early on learned that it had interests that needed to be represented in the government, and so Orthodox political parties were established. Some came, some went, but they played a small role. Generally speaking, the Orthodox world, until very recently, was quite content to almost rubber stamp anything that a government in Israel wanted or needed, so long as it continued to receive its stipends for yeshiva students and its exemption of students from serving in the army. So it didn't matter if it was a left-wing government, a right-wing government. The Orthodox political parties, for the most part, offered no opinion to either way. That way they could go with either coalition. They could go with the left-wing coalition or a right-wing coalition. It didn't really matter because all you needed to get their votes to be part of your coalition, which is to say your government, but you had to have a certain number. I'm not going to go into the whole political system now, but it's built on coalitions. And if all you needed to get their votes on everything you want as a prime minister was to let them have their yeshivas and not fight in the army, who wanted them to fight in the army anyway? They were unfit. I mean, they could have been fit, but they were yeshiva bochers. You know, their whole lifestyle was very different. Their whole upbringing was very different. Um, Many of them spoke Yiddish. They didn't even speak Hebrew. So it was very hard. It was impractical. The army didn't even want them, truthfully. Many Israelis were indignant about them not being in the army, but it wasn't that many. Even as the numbers grew, their strength at the polls grew. And so as they have more numbers, their rabbis told their followers to go vote. And so their role in every coalition became even more and more important, more and more meaningful. And again, all they wanted was to keep the stipends coming to yeshiva students and keep us, our boys, from having to serve in the army. And as their power has grown, so has their influence over society. Because once you realize that you are all but indispensable in forming any government in Israel, why stop? Why stop at giving our students their stipends and giving our students exemptions from Israeli military service? We have other values too. Okay, we have other values that we think are also vital for us and for the country, like buses operating on Shabbat, public transportation operating on Shabbat, which was for many years in Israel a very, very important thing because Israelis, um, a majority of Israelis did not have cars. And so public transportation in the years that I was living in Israel, 1974 and 79, uh, people went on buses. I mean, the bus service was very, very important because to own a car was all but impossible. It was just too expensive. There's no cars made in Israel. They all came from Europe and America. And the Israeli taxes on them were 100%. The cost of gas, a liter, which is about a fourth of a gallon, cost as much as a gallon of gas in the United States. So gas prices were ridiculous. Israelis are crazy drivers. The insurance rates were astronomical. The cost of maintaining a car was astronomical. So the public transportation was vital. And the Orthodox said, we have not had public transportation on Shabbat. We're not going to have public transportation on Shabbat. And this became a very important issue. And this was just one of many issues that strengthened the political strength of the Orthodox and does to this very day. Now, why am I giving you this whole background and stuff? Because as Orthodox Judaism in the United States and in Western Europe saw that if you have a backbone, if you push hard enough, your voices will be heard. But if you just step back and just say, okay, give me this and that, and I won't bother you anymore, I won't bother you anymore, then that's all you'll ever get. And so that strength, which came from the Orthodox rabbinate in Israel, became more present in the Orthodox world here in the United States. And so in communities which had never been very supportive, for example, of federation, in communities which had never been engaged in many of the Jewish organizations which are central to Jewish community life, there was this sense that why aren't we seated at this table and why aren't our voices being heard and why aren't our needs being met and why aren't our schools being funded? And this has changed the dynamics of American Judaism. I think it's changed it for the best because in addition to their being at the table, getting more for their communities, the return request from them is we will give you more, but you have to give us more. In other words, you have to contribute to the campaign. You have to encourage your people to be involved in the Jewish community fiscally rather, to help the community. And when you play an equal role in the community financially, like everyone else, we will in turn listen to you when you come to us with your needs and your desires and the things that are very, very important to you. We've seen that right here in Houston. Lee Wunsch can speak to that issue even better than I can. But that is a change that I have seen in my own lifetime, and I've seen it over the last 25 years since I came to Houston. And it has changed the dynamic not only in Houston, but throughout the United States, and I think into Western Europe as well. Orthodoxy has asserted itself more, and at the same time, it's enjoyed benefits which have strengthened its presence in our communities. Houston was very fortunate. It had a rabbi here, Rabbi Joe Radinsky at UOS, who came to Houston and was what we would call a Klal Yisraelman. He was a rabbi Orthodox, but he was open to working with the non-Orthodox community. But that was not the case in most of the communities in the United States. I had pulpits in New York and pulpits in Rhode Island, and we had nothing to do with the Orthodox community. We had Orthodox rabbis, but they would not come to participate with us. They would not share with us. They would not sit with us. If we had community Yom HaShoah, Holocaust commemoration, they would not join with us. They would not be with Israel Independence Day. They would be with nothing. They would have nothing to do with us. And they would complain all the time that the community did nothing for them. But they would have nothing to do with us. It's what came first, the chicken or the egg? I don't know. But at some point, the Orthodox communities, even there, I'm told from my colleague, I have a colleague in Providence still, 2 colleagues, that the community has changed. What's changed is the rabbinic leadership. But it has nonetheless moved more in terms of its being involved in the community, but it is also at the same time moved to be more like the Orthodox rabbinate in Israel, which is to be more traditional. And we see a division here in Houston between UOS and Young Israel. Young Israel is a more right-wing orthodoxy. It was struggling until maybe 10 years ago. UOS was a more moderate orthodoxy. It was the dominant Orthodox synagogue in Houston for a long, long time. Today, the synagogue that is growing is Young Israel. There's a movement of Jews from the Northeast to Houston. They're drawn here by our lower cost of living, less expensive day schools, Orthodox day schools. This is all relative to where they are. More job opportunities, nicer lifestyle, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, the more Jews who come from the Northeast to Houston encourages other Jews from the Northeast to come to Houston as well. And when they come, I'm told overwhelmingly they are coming and joining Young Israel. Because it is more the orthodoxy of the more right wing, which is what New York Jewry is, which is more what Israeli Orthodox Jewry is. So that's a question that has impacted UOS. UOS is still large, it's still strong, but it is not the dominant synagogue in Houston in Orthodox Judaism that it was, I think, for a long, long time. Through no fault of the rabbinic leadership, but I think through the changing demographics of the Orthodox community here. Yes, Lee.
Can you just reflect on why Orthodoxy in America has, in fact, you just referenced Young Israel, moved to the right over the last 10, 15 years in terms of religious practice, and why they concurrently, against this trend of most American Jews, have moved to the right in terms of domestic politics?
Yes. I think everything is cyclical. American Jews and Western European Jews are influenced by their Christian neighbors. I don't think it's a conscious reflection, but we see parallels. When the mainstream Protestant churches dominated, Reform Judaism and liberal Judaism did, I should say Reform Judaism, but liberal Judaism, moderate Judaism, conservative Judaism did very well. Okay. Conservative Judaism and the mainstream Protestants are parallel religious movements. When American Judaism, the evangelicals began dominating, when the mainstream moderate Protestant denominations began stalling, parallel movement we have an evangelical orthodoxy, if you will, more fundamentalist, paralleling the more fundamentalist evangelical movement in the churches here in the United States. It ties into the politics as well, because as you move to the right religiously, as you move to the right in terms of Christian theology, then your politics move with it. And I think there are parallels here, there are parallels in Europe. And we've seen it in Israel as the Orthodox becomes more right wing, the government becomes more right wing, and these things tend to move in tandem a little bit. It's hard to know which one's causing which to move the way it does, but there are parallels between the political and the religious in terms of the fundamentalism and the right wing. Um, I've been surprised. I think many observers of American Jewish politics have been surprised by the number of Orthodox Jews who have become very strong in their conservative support. You know, for since actually before FDR, people think that FDR was the president who actually pulled Jews into the Democratic Party. It actually preceded FDR. FDR was just another um, sort of landmark along the way. But um, the more liberal religious parties, the more religious political parties here in the United States um, had the best policies in terms of welcoming immigrants and um, for Jews, that was a very important factor in the 1930s and 40s and 50s. And so the Democratic Party had a hold on many Jews. Some say it's because the non-Orthodox are more concerned about social action, and there's more social action in the Democratic Party. But I don't know that that has really proven itself to be the defining factor. When Jews are asked, why do they vote more Democratic than Republicans? Some 70% still vote Democratic, but that's down from 80%. Social action is not really, social justice is one of the factors, but there's other factors too. And some of it now is habit, I think. Um, if you're raised a certain way, very often you'll follow the traditions of your parents. But on so many factors here, there could be a real good book written by somebody on why Jews vote Democratic to the extent that they do. Um, and we may see some changes. I mean, I don't know. But Israel has become a very conservative country politically and religiously. Um, my son lives there and he describes what it's like. Um, very strong support for President Trump, and very strong support for Bibi Netanyahu among the Orthodox. So um, I think there's been sort of a global reshuffling and a swing to the right, and we'll have to see what happens going forward in America and Western Europe, politically and religiously, and see how they continue to be in tandem with one another. Yes. Um,
Rabbi Joan Lupaloff here. How does Chabad fit in to this mesh of orthodoxy and its views on how it relates, especially to the young, I guess you'd call them millennial, the kids that are basically in school and young group? How does Chabad introduce itself?
okay.
And
All right. One of the groups, one of the breakaways, if you will. I say breakaway because you may know that in the 18th, 17th, and 18th centuries, there was a battle that took place in much of Europe between the Hasidim and the Misnagdim. The Mitnagdim were those who were against the Hasidim. Okay, that's what neged means. It means against. So um, traditional Judaism in Europe was pretty staid, but it was also at a point where it was very backward. When you isolate yourself from the world as thoroughly as Orthodox Judaism did until the 17th and 18th centuries, and it was challenged to change finally, there was a restlessness among many Jews that even though we're Orthodox, which is even though we're very Jewish and very proud of being Jewish, and we believe fervently in the teachings and practices of Judaism, there's no joy in Judaism because the tenets of Orthodox Judaism in the Ashkenazi version were very strict, and they grew stricter and stricter over time. And uh, and so there was a group that arose that said we need to bring more joy into Judaism. We need to bring more singing. We need to have some melodies. We need to have some dancing. We need to have something to make this a more a fuller and richer religious experience. And these are called the Hasidim, which simply means the pious. And there were a number of sects which grew over time, over the next 200 years, that uh, that created Hasidic sects that began to step apart from the mainstream of Judaism, Orthodox Judaism. Now, they are still Orthodox Jews. They still hold the basic shared tenets, halakhic values of Orthodox Judaism. But they typically were founded by a, a, a person who became a Rebbe, which was a new notion, somebody who, like a dynasty. So you'd have a rabbi who would raise disciples to his understanding of what this Hasidic sect would be, what it would include. It wasn't so much a challenge of the halacha, it wasn't so much a challenge of core Jewish values, but it was a way to lessen the severity and the stringency of Judaism in their own unique ways. Today, there are, God knows how many different Hasidic sects. The largest Hasidic sect is the Satmar Hasidim. You may have heard of them. They have some 26,000 households. You have the Lubavitch, which are next. That's the Chabad, 16,000 or so. Ger, 11,000. The Vishnitz, 10,000. The Belt, 7,000. The Breslov, 7,000. And there's dozens more, really. And each one is separate and separated from each other in a peculiar kind of way. You would think that some of the Hasidic sects would work together, but they don't work together. They are very, very independent. And in Israel, where they are all crowded together into large areas and small areas, they actually get into physical altercations with one another. They don't get along. Probably the least liked among them all is the Lubavitch, which is funny because here in the United States, we think of the Lubavitch very differently. From the perspective of the other Orthodox and the other Hasidim in Israel, the one thing that the Lubavitch followers do is the one thing that we love the most, and that is they reach out to non-observant Jews. And this is anathema to these other Hasidic sects, which are very insular. And they don't want their sects to be adulterated, if you will, by people coming in who are not observant or as pious, as religious, as stringent as they are. They don't want to know these people, let alone bring them into their synagogues and communities. So the fact that that is one of the main core teachings of Lubavitch Hasidim, because their Rebbe established it as such, Rabbi Schneerson, it is considered sort of outside the pale of Hasidic and Orthodox Judaism in Israel. Now, that doesn't say Hasidim don't have their following there. They do have their following there, but it's a small movement in there. It's a smaller movement in Israel, very independent, and they do their own thing, just like they do here. Okay, now here in the United States, the Lubavitch Hasidim have really taken root. They established a very strong presence in Brooklyn, and the Rebbe created a whole group of emissaries to go out all over the world and to spread Torah, but to spread Lubavitch ideas. And there are many people who really hold them up to a very high standard and love them and appreciate and value and cherish and treasure them. We have to remember that the Lubavitch are happy to do that. That's what they're meant to do. But they're not accepting you really as who you are. They're really working to bring you into a higher level of Judaism. Um, and it has been said, and I think with much justification, that there are more, I don't know if it was justification, I can't say this. I have no statistics to really bear that out. But there is a saying that there are more Hasidic rabbis than there are Hasidic Lubavitch. There are more Lubavitch rabbis than there are Lubavitch Jews. Okay, now what does that mean? How do you get there? If you go to a Lubavitch shul, it's filled with people who aren't Lubavitch. Okay, they're not really Lubavitch. They're not there. They're not actually observing like the Lubavitch Hasidim. They're not keeping the halacha. They're not strictly kosher. They're not this and they're not that. It's one of the maybe the only Hasidic sect where that will be the case. If you go into a Satmar shul, everybody's Satmar. No question, they're all Satmar. You go into a Ger yeshiva, they're all Ger yeshivas. Okay, just Gers. You go into a Lubavitch center or Lubavitch shul, you've got lots of people who are there who are not even observant, let alone observant to the level of Lubavitch. But they go there because they feel welcome. They go there because they like the Rebbe and his wife, always a lovely couple. They go there because they like the spirit, they like the warmth, they like the food. I mean, there's always a beautiful, a meal for you if you need a place to eat or you want to come and spend Shabbos with the Rebbe. And they're very welcoming, and you come in and you feel embraced. Israeli Jews who moved to the United States often attach themselves to Lubavitch because they want some kind of connection to Judaism, but they don't want it forced down their throats. They think conservative and reform are too Americanized, but they think that the Lubavitch, because they knew it in Israel, they knew Hasidim in Israel, they knew Orthodox in Israel, they think they understand it better, they feel more at home with it, which is like kind of an ironic thing because Lubavitch Hasidim are really not that supportive of Israel. But nonetheless, they do good things, and that impresses people, and I support what they do for the positive reasons that I've given. But they're not supportive of conservative and reform Jews or Judaisms. They worked against us in Israel, and a lot of their support financially comes from conservative and reform Jews who like what they're doing because they do many good things, without really understanding who they are and what they are. But I wish them well. They do no harm. That's fine, and they certainly bring people into the Jewish fold that may have strayed. My daughter, when she was traveling years ago all over Southeast Asia, she could plot her course through Thailand, through Vietnam, through Singapore. I mean, she gave us the whole litany. There was always a Chabad house. So everywhere she went, she always had Friday night and Shabbat meals there. She was always welcomed. And then during the week, if she wanted just to go over for lunch or dinner, they always made sure there was food for her. And so, I mean, it's a beautiful thing. They didn't make her sign anything. They didn't make her give anything. When we went to Europe on a tour over the years, we went just a couple of summers ago, we were in Italy, and we were there for Shabbat. The Chabad rabbi welcomed us for Shabbos dinner, Shabbos breakfast, Shabbos lunch, Shabbos Havdalah. I mean, couldn't have been nicer, couldn't have been warmer, and so I have to say kol hakavod. But, yeah. All right. Okay, we're going to stop it here. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you
Thank
next
you.
week. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Rabbi.
My pleasure.
Thanks,
Thank you
everyone.
very much. Thank you.
Yeah.
Rabbi,